Okay, let's unpack this. We've got some really interesting material here looking at how Japanese aggression essentially led to the start of World War II in Asia.
That's right. It's a complex picture, but there are key events we can trace.
Yeah, we have info on Japan and Manchuria, the League of Nations reaction, something called the Lytton Report, the challenges facing China's leader Jiang Jiechi, and the terrible events in Nanking.
hmm
So our goal today is to sort of connect these pieces, make sense of how Japan's expansionist drive really ignited the conflict over there.
Exactly. It wasn't just one thing, but a series of steps, escalations.
Right. And, maybe understand how the international community responded or failed to respond.
Precisely. Each event builds on the last one. It's
Yeah.
crucial to see those links.
Okay, so let's start at, well, the beginning seems logical. Manchuria, 1931. What was Manchuria and what happened?
So Manchuria is this region in northeastern China, very rich in natural resources, which Japan desperately needed for its industries.
Resources, okay.
And Japan invaded and occupied it in 31.
Just like that. What was their justification?
Well, they used an excuse. There was this incident, the Mukden incident. A section of railway owned by Japan was sabotaged.
Sabotaged. By who?
Japan blamed China. But evidence strongly suggests Japanese military personnel actually staged the explosion themselves.
Staged it. Wow. So a pretext to invade.
Pretty much, yeah. It gave them the reason they needed to move troops in and take control. It was part of a bigger ambition, too. This growing ultranationalism in Japan, the idea of leading Asia.
Okay, so they take Manchuria. What's the result for Japan? Did they get what they wanted?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They secured those resources, expanded their territories significantly, and then they created this puppet state called Manchukuo,
Manchukuo. Puppet state meaning.
meaning it looked like an independent country, but Japan was really calling all the shots behind the scenes. It was a key part of their plan to build an empire in Asia. The first big step, you could say.
Okay, so a major act of aggression. How did the world react? What about the League of Nations? Wasn't that their job to stop this kind of thing?
Yes. The League was set up after World War I, precisely to maintain international peace and prevent aggression.
So what did they do about Manchuria?
Well, they did react. They condemned Japan's actions. They said it was wrong.
Condemn them. Okay.
And that was largely it. The League had a fundamental weakness. It didn't have its own military force, and it couldn't really force member states to comply. It relied on diplomatic pressure and potential economic sanctions, which major powers were hesitant to apply forcefully.
So no real teeth behind the condemnation then.
Not really, no.
Yeah.
Especially against a major power like Japan that was determined to act,
What was the impact of that weak response? Did Japan just shrug it off?
pretty much. It showed Japan, and frankly other potentially aggressive nations too, that the League wasn't a serious obstacle. It exposed the League's, well, impotence in many ways.
So it kind of emboldened them?
You could definitely say that. It likely encouraged Japan to push further later on, knowing there wouldn't be major consequences from the international community, or at least from the League.
Okay. Now, there was also an investigation, right? The Lytton Report. What was that about?
Yes, the League commissioned an investigation. A group led by Lord Lytton from Britain went to Manchuria to investigate the situation firsthand and report back. This was in 1932.
And what did Lord Lytton find? Did his report back up Japan's story?
No, not at all. The Lytton report concluded that Japan's invasion was unjustified aggression. It stated that Manchuria rightfully belonged to China and should be returned.
So the League's own report called Japan out.
Explicitly, yes. It laid the facts bare and sided against Japan's actions.
Surely that must have had an effect. International condemnation backed by an official report.
You'd think so, but Japan's reaction was quite dramatic. They didn't accept the report's findings.
They just ignored it.
Worse, in 1933, Japan responded to the League adopting the report by walking out. They quit the League of Nations altogether.
They just left.
Yep, just walked away because it was a huge statement, basically saying, we reject your authority and the rules of this international body.
Wow. What did that signal to everyone else?
It was incredibly significant. It showed Japan's complete defiance of international opinion and law. And again, it highlighted the League's inability to actually enforce its own principles against a determined aggressor. A major power thumbing its nose at the world order. It set a dangerous precedent.
Okay, so while this is happening on the international stage, what's going on inside China? They had their own leader, Jiang Jiechi, right? Chiang Kai-shek.
Yes, Jiang Jiechi was the leader of the nationalist government of China, the Kuomintang. And he was facing, well, an incredibly difficult situation.
How so?
He was juggling multiple massive challenges simultaneously. His primary goal was trying to unify China, which was fragmented with warlords and regional powers.
Okay, unification.
But he was also locked in a bitter civil war against the Chinese communists, led by Mao Zedong.
Right, the Civil War.
And on top of those huge internal struggles, he now had Japan aggressively encroaching on Chinese territory. His attention and resources were stretched incredibly thin.
So, fighting on multiple fronts, essentially. How prepared was China's military to actually take on Japan at this point?
Honestly, not very prepared. China's military was large, but poorly equipped and trained compared to the Japanese army, which was much more modern and industrialized. Japan had superior weaponry, air power, naval power.
So, a big mismatch.
It's a significant mismatch, yes. China was still largely agrarian, lacked heavy industry, and its forces were often fragmented. Jiang knew a full-scale war with Japan would be devastating early on.
How did this weakness affect their ability to resist Japan's advances, especially after Manchuria?
It meant that resisting Japan effectively was incredibly difficult. Jiang often had to make painful choices, sometimes trading space for time, trying to consolidate his own power and build up strength while avoiding decisive, potentially disastrous confrontations with the Japanese forces.
Which must have been hard, politically and morally.
Immensely. And this inability to halt the Japanese advance ultimately contributed to further tragedies, like what happened in Nanking.
Right, Nanking, the rape of Nanking, 1937. This event sounds truly horrific. What happened there?
It is one of the most brutal episodes of the era. In December 1937, the Japanese Imperial Army captured Nanking, which was China's capital at the time, and what followed was not just military occupation, but weeks of horrific violence and atrocities committed by Japanese soldiers against the city's inhabitants. Mass killings of captured Chinese soldiers and male civilians, widespread rape, looting, arson. It was systematic brutality on a massive scale.
The scale.
Yeah.
Our notes mention hundreds of thousands killed.
Estimates vary, but yes, historians generally agree that hundreds of thousands of unarmed civilians and prisoners of war were murdered. The sheer cruelty and the scale of the violence are almost beyond comprehension.
That's horrifying. How did the world react when news of this got out?
There was widespread international revulsion and condemnation. News reports, often from Westerners who were in Nanking and witnessed the events, shocked the global public. It starkly revealed the brutality of the Japanese military campaign.
Did it change anything tangible, though, beyond outrage?
It certainly hardened international opinion against Japan. It fueled anti-Japanese sentiment, particularly in the United States.
Yeah.
It also crucially strengthened Chinese resolve to resist.
Strengthen their resolve. How so?
The sheer horror of Nanking became a powerful symbol for the Chinese people of what they were fighting against. It underscored the existential nature of the threat and rallied support for the nationalist government's war effort, despite the hardships. It made compromise seem impossible.
I see. So Nanking wasn't just an isolated atrocity, it had wider consequences.
Definitely. It deepened the conflict, made reconciliation far harder, and brought the brutality of Japan's expansion into sharp focus for the rest of the world, contributing to the growing sense that this was more than just a regional conflict.
Okay, so let's try and tie this all together. We have Manchuria in 31, the weak League response, Japan leaving the League after the Lytton Report, Jiang Jieshi struggling internally, and then the horrors of Nanking in 37. How does this sequence explain the start of WWII in Asia?
Well, you can see a clear escalation. Japan's invasion of Manchuria was the opening act, driven by resource needs and imperial ambitions.
Right, the first big move.
The failure of the League of Nations to take meaningful action basically signaled that international mechanisms for peace were ineffective against determined aggression. This lack of consequences was key.
It removed a potential break.
Exactly. Japan, ignoring the Lytton Report and leaving the League, showed their utter contempt for international norms. They were making their own rules.
Okay.
Meanwhile, China's internal divisions and military weakness, personified by Jiang Jieshi's struggles, meant they couldn't effectively push back against Japanese encroachment in the early stages.
Making them a vulnerable target.
Precisely. And this vulnerability allowed Japan to push deeper, leading to escalating violence, culminating in atrocities like the rape of Nanking. That event, in turn, solidified Chinese resistance and shocked the global conscience, making the conflict much harder to contain or resolve peacefully.
So it's like a domino effect. Aggression, weak response, more aggression, defiance, escalating violence.
That's a good way to put it. Each event built upon the last. Japan's initial calculated risk in Manchuria paid off, encouraging further expansion. The international community's inability or unwillingness to act decisively allowed the situation to spiral. The brutality shown in China, especially Nanking, galvanized resistance and made a wider conflict almost inevitable, as Japan's ambitions continued to grow and clash with other powers' interests in Asia and the Pacific. This chain of events undeniably laid the groundwork for what became the Asian theater of World War II.
It's a really stark picture when you lay it out like that. This deep dive certainly clarifies how those early sparks in the 1930s weren't isolated fires but led to a huge blaze.
Hmm.
You see how unchecked aggression, step by step, can lead down a very dark path. It really makes you reflect on, well, the effectiveness of international bodies then and maybe even now.
It does raise those questions.
So, thinking about this whole chain,
Hmm.
what stands out most, perhaps for our listeners to consider, is it the League's limitations that seem most significant?
That's definitely a major factor
Yeah.
to ponder, yeah. The gap between idealism and enforcement power.
Or maybe it's the sheer human cost, epitomized by Nanking, and how that brutality itself became a factor in escalating the conflict.
The impact of those atrocities on both Chinese resolve and global opinion is undeniable, a critical element.
It makes you wonder, how might history have been different if the initial aggression in Manchuria had been met with a stronger, more unified international response? Could that downward spiral have been averted? That's definitely something worth thinking about.